The water tower had been dry for 18 years. That was what the auctioneer said, the morning Cecily Marsh stood at the back of the crowd in Dellwood, Kansas, in the sharp, still air of early April 1891, watching men bid on a grain elevator that nobody wanted and a mule harness that everybody did. The tower stood at the eastern edge of town, where the main road bent toward the rail depot, a hulking iron cylinder set on 6 riveted legs, roughly 40 feet tall, dark with rust along its seams and crowned with a low conical roof from which a rusted overflow pipe angled out like a broken arm. The paint that had once covered it, red, she thought, though it was difficult to say now, had flaked away in patches that revealed the raw iron beneath, orange-brown and granular, the color of old blood. It had been built in 1870 to supply the railroad with water for its steam engines. Then the rail company had rerouted its main line 14 miles north, and the depot had become a storage shed, and the tower had been drained and left standing, because no one had gotten around to doing anything else with it. Nobody had opened the access hatch at the tower's base in so long that the locking bolt had seized in its housing from rust. Nobody had climbed the exterior service ladder since a young railroad employee had done so in 1878, noted in a maintenance log that the interior showed no significant structural concerns, and descended never to return. Nobody knew what 18 years of darkness and isolation had preserved inside the cylinder's corrugated iron walls. Cecily Marsh, who was 20 years old and had arrived in Dellwood 6 days earlier with $2.40, a carpetbag, and no living relatives, was looking at the tower with an expression that the auctioneer, a pink-faced man named Stovall, would later describe as the look of someone reading a map in a language no one else spoke. She had noticed 4 things in her 6 days of careful observation that no one else appeared to have noticed, or if they had noticed them, had not thought worth mentioning. She had also noticed that Reginald Glover, who owned the Dellwood Commercial Bank and 300 acres of cropland north of town, and held the mortgages on approximately half the businesses on Main Street, grew visibly uncomfortable whenever the water tower came into direct conversation. Not alarmed, not aggressive, just, briefly carefully, still in the way a man goes still when he hears a sound he recognizes and would prefer not to identify, the auctioneer called the tower. He described it as a non-functional municipal water structure with unclear title, sold as is, no guarantees expressed or implied. He opened bidding at $1, no one bid. He opened it at 50 cents. The crowd shuffled. Cecily raised her hand and offered $2. In the silence that followed, a man near the front laughed first, and then several others did, the laughter rolling back through the crowd in a comfortable wave. The laughter of people enjoying a joke they did not need to understand fully to participate in. Someone said something about needing a ladder to use the outhouse. Someone else said she must have gotten confused and thought she was buying the water, not the tower. The auctioneer himself had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but he brought his gavel down with the automatic efficiency of a man who had learned not to question a legitimate bid. $2. Sold. Reginald Glover, standing at the edge of the crowd in a gray wool suit with his hat held against his chest in both hands, looked at Cecily Marsh for a moment, just a moment, with an expression she could not read at that distance but did not forget. What was inside that iron cylinder, in the dark above the rust and the silence, was going to cost him everything he had spent 20 years carefully building. Stay with us. She had grown up in Missouri, in a river town called Paxton Bend, where the Mississippi in spring ran the color of old bronze and the smell of water and catfish and river mud was so pervasive that she had been 15 before she visited her cousin in St. Louis and realized that other towns smelled entirely different. Her mother, Greta, had run the town's small newspaper, the Paxton Bend Courier, 4 pages, twice weekly, printed on a hand-operated press that occupied the front room of their house and made the whole building hum on press days like a living thing. Greta Marsh was a small, dark-haired woman with ink-stained fingers and the combative energy of someone who had been underestimated so consistently that she had turned it into fuel. She had taken over the paper when Cecily's father died of a fever contracted in the river bottoms when Cecily was 8, and she had run it without sentimentality and without self-pity, and it had survived. Cecily grew up in that front room. She learned to set type before she was tall enough to reach the compositing tray without a step stool. She learned to read a story backward, as type required, as easily as forward. She learned to ask the question behind the question. Her mother's phrase for the habit of assuming that whatever someone told you first was probably the version they had decided to give you, and that the truth lived one layer further down. accessible only to those willing to keep pressing. Her mother also taught her arithmetic, which the school in Paxton Bend taught badly, and bookkeeping, which it didn't teach at all. A woman who can read a ledger, her mother said once, cannot be robbed slowly. This was the kind of aphorism Greta Marsh delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a physical law. By the time Cecily was 16, she was writing a quarter of the paper's content herself. Small stories, at first, town council minutes, reports on the spring fair, a column on the growing season that she compiled from talking to every farmer who came into the general store on Saturdays. Then larger ones. A piece on the condition of the Paxton Bend Bridge, which the county had been claiming was repaired since 1884, and which Cecily had personally inspected and found to have 3 compromised cross members. The county repaired the bridge 3 weeks after publication. Greta printed the story with Cecily's name on it, which was not customary for a 16-year-old, and which Cecily never forgot the feeling of, her name in ink, attached to a thing that had changed something real. She had her mother's instinct for the gap between the official version and the actual one. She had her own particular gift for numbers, not just arithmetic but pattern, the way numbers in sequence told stories that prose couldn't, the way a set of figures could contradict a set of words without raising its voice. Greta Marsh died in the autumn of 1890, quickly and without warning, a stroke that took her between Tuesday's press run and Wednesday's distribution. She was 51 years old and had been intending to write an editorial about the State Railroad Commission. The paper died with her, or close enough. The press was mortgaged, as it turned out. Cecily had not known, and the creditor, a printing supply company in St. Louis, was not interested in working with a 20-year-old girl who had no operating capital and no legal standing to sign contracts. They took the press in November. They took the building by December, which had also been mortgaged, in a transaction Cecily's mother had arranged years ago that she had never mentioned, perhaps because she had always expected to resolve it herself and had not anticipated running out of time. Cecily left Paxton Bend in February of 1891 with what she could carry, what she was owed from 2 months of accounts receivable that had gone uncollected, and the habit of her mother's mind, the question behind the question, the ledger behind the ledger. She had heard about Dellwood from a man on the train, a traveling goods salesman, who said it was a growing town with no newspaper, which struck Cecily as both an opportunity and a diagnosis. A town with no newspaper was a town where the official version went unquestioned. She had seen, in Paxton Bend, what that eventually produced. She arrived in early April with enough money to live on for approximately 2 weeks if she was careful, and with 4 observations she had made in her first 6 days in Dellwood that she had not yet decided what to do with. The first, the town's water came from a single well near the center of Main Street. It was insufficient for the population. People hauled water from the creek in summer. There had been a proposal, she'd heard, to sink a new municipal well, but it had stalled in the town council for 3 years without explanation. The second, Reginald Glover's bank held an unusual number of mortgages on properties that backed up against the northern side of town, above the old rail depot. He had acquired most of them in the 2 years following 1873. The third, the railroad's original survey of Dellwood, which she had found a copy of in the county clerk's files. She had spent an entire afternoon in those files, which the clerk had allowed with visible reluctance, showed a notation she had never seen explained. In the margin of the survey, beside a topographical marking near the old depot site, someone had written 2 words in pencil, faint but legible: pressurized source. The fourth, the water tower's overflow pipe, which should by any hydraulic logic have been positioned at the top of the cylinder, was positioned 14 feet below the rim, not at the overflow line, 14 feet below it. An overflow pipe below the overflow line was either an engineering error or a design choice, and the railroad company that had built the Dellwood depot in 1870 had not, as far as she had been able to determine, been in the habit of engineering errors. She had no tools and no help the first morning she walked the perimeter of the tower, the day after the auction, with the deed. A single handwritten page that Stovall had produced from a folder, with the air of a man performing a formality he found mildly absurd, folded in her coat pocket. The April wind came across the Kansas plain in long, unbroken waves, pressing at her skirt and pulling at her hair. The rail depot behind the tower had been converted to a grain storage use, judging by the smell and the mound of rotting chaff at its back wall. The ground around the tower's legs was flat and hard-packed, beaten by years of weather into a surface like gray brick. She circled the tower 3 times, looking up at its seams and rivets, noting where the rust was heaviest, at the lower seams, as you'd expect, and at the base of each support leg where it met the ground. But the legs themselves were sound. She pressed both hands against the nearest one and felt cold iron, solid and thick, the kind of construction meant to last a generation. The access hatch was on the south face of the tower, at ground level, a circular iron door roughly 2 feet in diameter, set into the cylinder's wall on 2 heavy hinges, with a bolt mechanism that had, as she had heard, seized with rust. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the overflow pipe, which emerged from the tower's wall at a height she estimated as 25 feet up from the ground, angled slightly downward, capped at its end with an iron fitting that had corroded shut. Why is it so low? She was still looking at the overflow pipe when she became aware that someone else was standing nearby. He was an old man, 70 perhaps, or past it, with the compressed, deliberate posture of someone whose body had taken a great deal of physical punishment over a long career and had arrived at a kind of truce with it. He wore a canvas work coat that had been patched at both elbows and both cuffs, and he held a battered hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim in a contemplative rotation. His name, she learned shortly, was August Hafer. He had been the railroad's master plumber for the Dellwood depot from 1868 to 1874, when the line was rerouted and his job with it. He had been watching her from across the road and had decided, apparently, that someone looking at his old tower with that degree of seriousness deserved conversation. He said, "You're looking at the overflow pipe." She said she was. He said, "Most people don't look at the overflow pipe." She said, "It's in the wrong place." August Hafer turned his hat twice more by the brim and then said, "No, it's not." He would not tell her everything at once. He was a methodical man, trained by a life of practical engineering to understand that the sequence of explanation mattered as much as its content, that you could give someone all the right information in the wrong order and leave them more confused than before. He told her to come back the next day and to bring water, because what he wanted to show her would take the whole morning. He was there when she arrived at 7 o'clock, with 2 canning jars of water and a pry bar she had borrowed from the livery. He had brought a full set of pipe tools in a canvas bag worn smooth with use, wrenches, a handled wire brush, a tin of petroleum jelly for the seized bolt. It took them 2 hours to break the bolt free. They worked in silence mostly, Hafer directing and Cecily applying force where he indicated, and by mid-morning the bolt had turned, grinding and reluctant, and the access hatch swung open on its hinges with a sound like a wounded animal. The smell that came out was iron and mineral water and something dark she couldn't name. Not rot exactly, more like the smell of stillness itself, of air that had been enclosed so long it had become something other than what it started as. She looked in. It was dark inside the cylinder, but the open hatch admitted a wedge of morning light that illuminated the interior for a few feet. The floor of the tank, meaning the lowest point of the cylinder inside, was a shallow concave dish of iron, and it was not empty. There was water in it, not much. Perhaps 2 inches, accumulated from condensation over the years. Iron sweating in the temperature changes of Kansas winters and summers, the moisture finding its lowest point and pooling there. She had expected this. What she had not expected was the color of the water, which was not the dark reddish-brown of rust dissolved in condensation, but a clear, faint blue-gray that caught the light differently, as if it had a mineral content that plain condensation didn't. She looked at Hafer. He was nodding slowly, the way a man nods when a thing he has known for a long time is being confirmed by someone else for the first time. He said, "The railroad didn't build this tank to hold water from outside," he said. "They built it to hold water from below." The explanation took the rest of the morning, sitting on the bare earth with their backs against the warm south-facing iron of the tower, drinking water from the canning jars while the Kansas spring went about its business around them. In 1869, August Hafer told her, the railroad's advanced survey team had identified what their engineer classified as a pressurized artesian source directly beneath the depot site. Not a standard well location, a true artesian, where underground water under natural pressure would rise on its own to the surface, requiring no pumping. The notation she had found in the county survey, pressurized source, was that team's record of the find. The railroad had designed the Dellwood water tower specifically to exploit it. The cylinder was not meant to store water hauled up from a surface well. It was designed as a pressure vessel. The artesian source below would push water up through a central pipe into the cylinder, which would maintain the pressure and distribute it through the supply lines to the depot. This was why the overflow pipe was positioned at 25 feet rather than at the cylinder's rim. The artesian pressure would push the water to that height naturally, and the overflow pipe marked the functional water line, releasing the excess. In 1870, when construction was complete, it had worked exactly as designed. In 1873, the rail line had been rerouted north. The depot was decommissioned. The water tower was disconnected from its supply pipe. The connection valve at the base of the cylinder was closed and declared surplus. And in 1873, Reginald Glover, then a young man newly arrived in Dellwood, establishing what would become the commercial bank, had purchased 300 acres of land directly above the artesian source's projected catchment area at agricultural land prices in the months between the railroad's departure and the point at which anyone might have thought to reassess what the land was worth. August Hafer said this last part carefully, looking at the flat horizon rather than at Cecily, as if the information were a fragile object he was setting down rather than handing over. She asked him, "How do you know where he purchased?" He said, "Because I drew the survey map that showed the catchment. The railroad commissioned it. And I was told when the line rerouted that the map had been filed with the county and would be public record." She asked, "And was it?" He said, "I never checked. I had a family to move and a new job to find." She had checked. She had been through those county files. She had not found any railroad artesian survey map from 1869 or 1873. What she had found, and what she had not yet fully understood, was a gap in the filing sequence for that period, a run of reference numbers with no corresponding documents, like missing teeth. She was back in the county clerk's files the next morning, and she went through every document from 1870 to 1876, twice, carefully, in the systematic way her mother had taught her to read a ledger, not looking for what you expected to find, but noting everything that was there, and everything that should be there, and wasn't. The missing map was not there, but something else was. In a folder of miscellaneous correspondence from 1872, letters between the county surveyor and various parties about road grading projects, livestock boundary disputes, the unglamorous administrative sediment of a young county, there was a single page that did not belong to the rest. It was a letter, written in a clipped formal hand, from the county surveyor of that period, a man named Hollis, to someone whose name had been deliberately, carefully inked out, not smudged, inked out, with the specific considered quality of a redaction rather than an accident. The letter's substance, once she parsed the formal language of the period, was this. The writer had been asked to review a railroad survey document. He had reviewed it. He found the document's claims credible and the methodology sound. He recommended it be properly recorded. He noted, however, that he had been approached by a private party who had expressed interest in the document remaining unrecorded. He stated he had declined this approach. He stated he was filing the document. The document evidently had not been filed. She sat very still in the county clerk's office for several minutes. The clerk, a young man named Pruitt, who had been watching her with the slightly offended dignity of someone whose filing system was being subjected to extended scrutiny, did not interrupt her stillness. "What happened to Hollis, the county surveyor of 1872?" She asked Pruitt this question. He looked uncertain, then went to a different cabinet and produced a bound record of county officer appointments. Hollis had resigned in October 1872. The reason given was personal circumstances. He had been replaced in November of that year. She asked who had replaced him. Pruitt read the name from the record. The replacement county surveyor, appointed November 1872, was a man whose family connection to Reginald Glover she established 2 hours later, through the county marriage and property records, as a first cousin by marriage. She did not yet know what was inside the tower. She had opened the hatch. She had seen the clear water. She had heard Hafer's explanation. But the tower's interior, above the 2-inch pool at the base, was still dark to her. She needed to drain it, or rather, she needed to open the supply valve. Not drain, fill. The supply valve was at the base of the cylinder, on the interior. She had seen it through the open hatch, a large iron wheel valve of the railroad pattern, corroded but potentially functional. If she opened it, and if Hafer was right about what lay beneath, the artesian pressure would do what pressure does. It would rise. She brought Hafer back on a Thursday morning with a wrench that fit the valve wheel and her 2 jars of water and no particular ceremony. The weather had turned properly warm, and the prairie around the old depot smelled of new grass and the particular electric quality of air before a distant storm. The valve wheel required both of them and 20 minutes of effort, but it turned. It turned one full rotation, then two, then three, and on the fourth rotation Cecily heard something she had not expected. A deep, low moan from beneath the ground, like the earth itself clearing its throat after a long silence. Then a rushing sound. Then through the open access hatch, she watched the water come. It came steadily, not explosively, a strong and purposeful upwelling from the pipe at the cylinder's floor, clear and cold and carrying that faint mineral quality she had seen in the pooled condensation. It rose quickly, 3 inches, 6. By the time it reached the overflow pipe's height, 25 feet up, by hydraulic logic doing what it was designed to do, she could hear it running freely out through the overflow fitting and outside, which had apparently unseized as the pressure built. Hafer stood next to her and said nothing, but she heard him let out a long, slow breath. The water ran clear, it did not slow. It was, exactly as designed in 1869, a self-sustaining artesian supply that needed no pump, no hauling, no municipal well infrastructure, only a pressure vessel to collect it and distribution pipes to carry it. Dellwood had been sitting above sufficient water for a generation. Dellwood had been hauling water from a creek in summer for a generation. The proposal to sink a new municipal well had been stalled in the town council for 3 years. Reginald Glover sat on the town council. He had sat on it for 11 years. He chaired its infrastructure committee. She needed to be careful now. She knew this with the same clarity that she had always known, in the newspaper work, when a story reached the point at which carelessness could ruin it. Not the truth of it, but its effect, its ability to do what it needed to do. A story told badly, to the wrong people, in the wrong sequence, achieved nothing. She spent a week in the county records, methodically and without announcing her purpose, pulling every document she could find that touched on Glover's land acquisitions, the artesian survey history, the water tower's ownership chain, and the infrastructure committee's decisions over the past decade. Pruitt, the clerk, began to look at her differently around day 3, not with suspicion exactly, but with the cautious attention of a man who has realized that the person digging through his cabinets knows what they are looking for. On day 5, he helped her find a filing box she had been unable to locate. He did not explain why. She did not ask. She found in that box the thing she had been looking for without knowing its exact shape. The original artesian survey map, drawn by August Hafer in 1869, stamped received by the county surveyor's office in October 1872. The stamp was Hollis's, his official mark, proving he had followed through on what his letter said he intended, and then stamped a second time in November 1872, with a different mark she did not at first recognize. When she looked up the second stamp in the office's records, it was the mark of the replacement county surveyor, Glover's cousin by marriage. The second stamp read, "Withdrawn from public record, Inca late diamantation." The map had not been lost, it had been formally withdrawn. Withdrawn and refiled in a miscellaneous box where it would sit, correctly catalogued and therefore never flagged as missing, for 19 years. She also found in August Hafer's meticulous records from his railroad years. He had kept everything. In a trunk in his daughter's house, where she retrieved them with his permission, a letter he had received from the railroad's engineering supervisor in 1873, informing him that the Dellwood artesian survey had been filed with the county and was a matter of public record, and thanking him for his work. The railroad had believed the map was public. Only the county surveyor's office had known it wasn't. She made copies of everything in the careful longhand she had learned setting type. Letter-perfect reproduction, the muscle memory of a compositor. She made 3 sets. She kept one. She gave one to Hafer. She gave one to Pruitt, who accepted it without comment and placed it in a new folder he labeled with a deliberate and unhurried precision that suggested he had been waiting for a reason to create it. The instrument she had, her mother's instrument, was the press. She didn't have a press. But she knew what to do with words, and Dellwood had no newspaper. She spent 4 days writing. She had rented a room above the dry goods store for 50 cents a week, a narrow space with a sloped ceiling and a window that looked east toward the tower. She could see the overflow pipe from her cot. In the mornings, when the light was right, she could see the faint glitter of water still running from it. She wrote a 14-page account of everything she had found, beginning with the 1869 artesian survey and ending with the infrastructure committee's history of inaction on the municipal well proposal. She wrote it the way her mother had taught her to write anything important. In plain language, with every claim attached to a specific document or a named source, and with the numbers laid out clearly enough that a reader could follow the arithmetic themselves. She did not editorialize. She did not accuse Glover of crime in her own voice. She stated what the documents showed and let the sequence speak. She had it typeset. A printer in the next town over agreed to set and print 200 copies for $3.50, which was almost all she had left. And she brought the copies back to Dellwood on a Tuesday morning in a wagon borrowed from the livery. She left one copy on the desk of every council member. She left one at the general store, one at the blacksmith, one at the post office, one at the school. She left a copy with the county clerk, and a copy with Pruitt, specifically, who had earned his own. She sent 3 copies by post to the nearest city newspaper, to the Territorial Railroad Commission, and to the county court. She left one copy on the desk of Reginald Glover's bank, addressed to him by name, on top of his morning correspondence. Then she walked back to her room above the dry goods store, and waited. The town's response moved the way Cecily had seen news move in Paxton Bend. Not all at once, not in a wave, but in a series of smaller recognitions that accumulated. The farmer, who had hauled creek water every August for 12 years, read her account and stood in front of the general store for a long time without speaking. The woman who ran the school boarding house had lost 2 children to a waterborne illness in the dry summer of 1886 and asked quietly and without drama if better water access in that year would have changed their situation. The answer, which Cecily could not give her for certain but which the arithmetic of it suggested, made the woman's face go through several expressions in rapid sequence and then settle into something that was not grief exactly, but its refinement. The council met in emergency session within the week. Glover was present. He was, as Cecily had expected, prepared. A man with his resources did not go to an emergency council meeting unprepared. He had a lawyer. He had an argument about the complexity of the historical record and the difficulty of attribution in matters of archival management. He was smooth and careful and entirely unconvincing to a room full of people who had just read 14 pages of documents with their own names or their neighbors' names in the margins. He did not resign. He was not that kind of man. Pride ran too deep, and he had not yet understood, perhaps, that the thing driving what was happening to him was not anger but clarity. His cousin, the former county surveyor, had died in 1883. The chain of legal accountability was complex and fragile, but the infrastructure committee's membership was reorganized. The artesian survey map was re-entered into public record by Pruitt, with a notation that it had been incorrectly withdrawn in 1872. The Railroad Commission wrote back to Cecily within 3 weeks, with a surprising thoroughness. Apparently, having had their own long-standing interest in what had happened to the 1869 survey, their engineers had commissioned and filed. The artesian source being connected to the water tower that was now Cecily's property. The tower, purchased for $2 at an auction 4 weeks prior, was hers. The water rights attached to it were governed by the same federal easement language that governed artesian sources on railroad-adjacent property, which was the sort of legal instrument that turned out to matter enormously when properly invoked. She did not become the town's water supplier. She was 20 years old and had no capital to build distribution infrastructure and no interest in becoming the kind of person who owned a town's water. She negotiated an arrangement with the council, through the newly reorganized infrastructure committee, by which the tower and its artesian rights were transferred to the municipality in exchange for the cost of the printing she had done, and a formal acknowledgement in the council minutes of the sources, history, the survey, the withdrawal, the 19 years of suppression. She wanted it in the record. She wanted it in ink in a public document where it could not be managed away. The council accepted this with a solemnity that told her, more than any individual expression in the room, that they understood what had been done to them and by whom and for how long. Glover remained in Dellwood. He retained his bank and some of his land, though the process of disentangling what had been acquired under conditions of informational fraud from what had not was slow and irregular, conducted by lawyers and county officials who were not for the most part aggressive in the matter. He was diminished. He was not destroyed. He continued to take his meals at the hotel dining room and to attend church on Sundays and to conduct himself with the composed dignity of a man who had decided that dignity was the one card he had left to play. Cecily watched him from a distance and felt, not satisfaction exactly, but the particular settling sensation of something having been properly completed. The documentary record was now accurate. The public record now matched what had actually occurred. That was what she had come to do, though she had not known it until she got there. She stayed in Dellwood. She had not intended to. She had thought of it as a through stop, a town she would leave once she had found something more to move toward. But she found instead that she had already found it without recognizing it as such. The town had no newspaper, it still didn't. The council was spending its infrastructure budget on extending the artesian supply pipes, which were expected to reach the center of town by late summer, and there was no civic budget for a press. Cecily wrote to 4 printing supply companies in the region explaining her situation and her intentions and asking about payment arrangements. 3 did not respond. The 4th, a family-run operation in Wichita, offered to sell her a second-hand press in working condition for a payment arrangement of $30 over 18 months, with the monthly installment set at $2. The kind of arrangement that would have been unavailable to her without the council minutes entry, naming her role in the water tower matter, which the Wichita printer had apparently read, having received a copy by post from an acquaintance in Dellwood. The press arrived in July. It was a Washington hand press, older than she was, with a worn but serviceable platen and an ink roller that needed regrinding. She set it up in a storefront on Main Street, ground floor, south-facing windows, the light good for composition, at a rent of $4 a month that she negotiated by offering the landlord a quarter-page advertisement in perpetuity. The landlord, who had also hauled creek water in summer for the better part of a decade, shook her hand with more warmth than the economics of the arrangement would by themselves have generated. The first issue of the Dellwood Weekly Register ran in August of 1891. 4 pages, twice weekly, the same as the Paxton Bend Courier had been at its beginning. The front page carried a complete account of the artesian source, the water tower's history, and the council's vote to begin distribution infrastructure, written with the precision of the reporting she had already done, and the plainness her mother had drilled into her from the time she was tall enough to reach the compositing tray. The back page carried the council minutes, in full, as public record. August Hafer read the first issue in his daughter's kitchen and told Cecily the next time he saw her that it was good work. He said it the way men of his generation said things they meant completely and could not say more elaborately, as a single sentence, delivered to the ground rather than to her face, carrying whatever freight he had decided to put in it. She understood him. She had been raised by a woman who also expressed large things in small words. The press hummed on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, the building alive around it in the way she remembered from Paxton Bend, the smell of ink and paper and warm metal filling the front room and drifting into the street. She hired a compositor in September, a 12-year-old boy named Wendell, whose quick hands and quicker memory she recognized as versions of her own at that age, and paid him 20 cents a day and the education of working at a press, which she considered fair on both sides. She was 20 years old. She had $2.03 after the first month's rent and press payment, which was, she reflected, almost exactly what she'd had when she arrived. The arithmetic of the situation did not especially trouble her. She had a press. She had a story she was still telling. She had a town that was, slowly and imperfectly and in the ordinary human fashion, waking up to itself. The water reached the center of Main Street on the 17th of September, running through newly laid iron pipes from the tower on the eastern edge of town, clear and cold and constant. People came out of the buildings to watch the public tap flow for the first time, which was a simple and undramatic thing. A tap opening, water coming, nothing remarkable in it, except that it had been withheld for reasons that had now been put into the record in plain language with named sources and documentary evidence. Cecily Marsh stood at the edge of the small crowd and watched, and thought of her mother's ink-stained fingers and the front room that had hummed on press days, and of a letter written by a county surveyor in 1872, and buried in a miscellaneous folder for 19 years, stamped received in one hand and withdrawn in another, waiting with the specific patience of documents, which is to say, indefinitely, uncomplaining, certain that someone would eventually come looking. Someone always came looking. That was what the press was for. Thank you for joining us on Cecily's journey. Before you go, we have one question for you. Have you ever found the truth buried in plain sight, something documented and available and simply unread for years, that changed how you understood a place or a person or a situation you thought you already knew? We'd love to hear your story in the comments.